Good evening, BlueHat. How's everyone doing? Yes, that's the spirit. We're so excited to be here on this stage and present our work, RingHopper, hopping from user mode, user space to God mode. Sorry, a bit excited. But first, some notices and disclaimers from our legal team. Thank you, legal team. And let's dive in. So, we will tell the story of how we obtained right primitives, how we hopped into a privilege mode, and acquired almost a total world domination. First, some background. At the beginning, there were 4 privilege rings. The most noticeable of those are the user mode, or user land, or user space. It goes by many names. And the kernel. The lower the number of the ring, the more privileges it has, and it's rather opaque to all of the rings above it. For instance, the user mode has no notion whatsoever of what's going on in the kernel. Over the years, new rings were added, the hypervisor or the VMM or ring -1 and the SMM. Let's talk about the SMM. It stands for System Management Mode, and at the beginning it was created as a small and humble processor operating mode that provides some low-level functionalities, mostly like power management and system hardware control, and OEMs ran their platform-specific code there. Yeah, and it's rather privileged, so it's transparent both to the OS, hypervisor, and etc. Over the years, the SMM grew bigger and bigger, and eventually it became a monstrosity that implements a wide range of functionalities like handling USB events and boot and runtime, and exposing some functionalities related to the system management BIOS. And the list is long. So together with the SMM grew the attack vector and the will of the attackers to attack the SMM. But this is fine, because over the years, lots of MSRs and registers were created with the sole purpose to keep the SMM safe. In order to switch to SMM, the kernel has to trigger a special kind of interrupt, a system management interrupt, or SMI for short. Once this interrupt is triggered, the processor switches to SMM, and like with any other interrupt, there is a handler corresponding to this interrupt's number. In our case, it's the SMI handler. Once the SMI handler is done handling the SMI, the processor switches back to the kernel. So SMM is a rather territorial mode. It has its own well-guarded portion of the RAM, called SMRAM, System Management RAM, while all the other entities have no notion whatsoever of what's going on in the SMRAM. For instance, if the kernel tries to read something from the SMRAM, it will get a bunch of FFs. So now that we know how to switch to SMM, let's talk a little bit about how we communicate with it. So whenever an SMI is triggered, the state of the CPU is saved to a special place in the SMRAM called the save state. It contains a lot of things, but we'll, for now, focus on the general purpose registers, and in particular, the values the general purpose registers had prior to entering the SMM. We saw that many BIOS vendors use one or more of these general purpose registers to point to a buffer that is accessible from both ring 0, the kernel, and the SMM, and use it as a medium to transfer data to and from the SMM. So at the top, we have the user space. Under that, we have the kernel running. And at the bottom of the iceberg, we have the SMM. In other words, if you're an attacker, and you are, SMM is where you want to be. You can brick the platform, steal sensitive information, evade practically any OS and VMM level security, potentially install a bootkit, disable secure boot, and the list is long. So what we did is we dove to the bottom of the iceberg, or shall I say hopped. We started with an agent running in user mode, hopped to the kernel, and from there to the SMM. And we did all that on this Intel NUC, the one you see there. And eventually, we found out that this research goes way, way beyond this poor little fella.
All right. So now let's talk a little bit about our findings, and we'll start with a small recap of what is a time of check, time of use vulnerability. So let's say we are SMM, and one of the services we provide to the operating system is a coffee service. Who doesn't like coffee? So the first thing that we start with is getting some buffer from the operating system. And since we do not trust the operating system, we must validate this buffer so that it points to a valid location. This will be the time of check. Then, once it was validated, we can use it and override its content with the value of coffee. This will be the time of use. As an attackers, we will try to modify the data in between, such that it will point somewhere else. And by doing so, we will again write primitives of the value coffee. So let's see a small diagram. Let's say we have an input buffer, and inside this input buffer, we have a pointer to the output buffer. In the normal scenario, SSMM will simply override the content of it with the value coffee. Obviously, this buffer will be located outside the SMRAM. But if we are an attackers, we'll try to redirect this address to the SMRAM, and by doing so, gain a write primitive of the value coffee to the SMRAM. So let's see the actual vulnerable coffee SMI handler. So we begin by reading the safe state. Remember, this is the way for us to access the input itself. And to be more precise, we access one of the general purpose registers, the RBX. Then, once we got the input buffer, we access its contents, which is the output buffer. Remember, then we check it, obviously, and we read this address once again that is stored inside the input buffer, and to override it with the value of coffee. This is the time of use, and like we already said, we'll try to modify the data in between. Okay, so how do we exploit such a time of check, time of use vulnerability? In a classic scenario, let's say we have a platform with 4 different cores, and let's say that the first core does the critical SMI handling, that's the validation and usage. So within the other cores, we may try to corrupt the data. Sometimes we may do this before the validation, and if so, nothing will happen, right? It simply will not pass the validation. Sometimes we may do this after the usage, and again, nothing will happen. But eventually, we may hit the right time and corrupt the data between the validation and usage. By doing so, we will be able to exploit the issue. However, once a core enters SMM, meaning SMI was triggered, all the cores are going idle, and we cannot use them to modify the data. So at this point, we got a little bit frustrated, and we thought, what is still alive, even though we are at SMM? And the answer was DMA. DMA stands for Direct Memory Access. This is the way for peripheral to access the platform's memory and basically to return data. By saying peripheral devices, I mean your GPU, your network interface card, or your storage device. So to test this hypothesis, we took something that is called PCI-LH. It's a cool project by Ulf Frisk, and this is the small red FPGA device that you see here, and it allows to trigger arbitrary read and write transactions to the RAM. Using it, we were able to exploit this time of check, time of use issue, which was very cool. But some of you may say, you know what? It requires physical access to the target. It's only an evil-made attack. At best, you can call it a supply chain attack, and we thought so as well. So we utilize something that exists on every platform, your hard drive. And to be more precise, we used a technique by Rafal Washuk that was presented a couple of years ago. And using this technique, we were able to manipulate DMA transactions from your storage device, the hard drive, back to the RAM, and by doing so, to exploit this time of check, time of use vulnerabilities. So remember the previous diagram? Now we add another component to the equation. We add the storage device, and on top of it, we place a malicious file. So we begin by making a read request to the storage device. The read request goes to the storage device, the hard drive, and the hard drive starts processing the request. Remember, once we read a file, it doesn't immediately come back to us. It takes some time to process the request. Then, once the request started processing, we made a hook inside a kernel, which manipulated the DMA request such that it will be redirected to our input buffer. Then, we trigger an SMI. All the cores are going idle, remember? The SMI handling enters the critical validation and usage phases, and with some luck, the data will be returned in the right time between the validation and usage, and will allow us to exploit the issue. And we were actually able to exploit this issue, which was super cool. All right, so now let's a small recap of what we did so far. We discussed what is SMM and how we can communicate with it. We also discussed what are time of check, time of use issues, and how we can convert them into write primitives to the SMRAM. Finally, we discussed how we can manipulate DMA transactions such that they will help us to exploit these time of check, time of use issues. And we also discussed how to execute code inside SMM. Okay, not yet. Benny?
All right. So we got the ability to write to the SMRAM. Let's do something useful with that. One of the modules we analyzed was the SMBIOS DMI edit driver. It's responsible for various tasks related to system management BIOS that we previously talked about, and our analysis was not in vain. We found some potential write primitives. It's worth noting that this list is not exhaustive, and this is far from being the only vulnerable module. However, this will be our ammunition for executing code in SMM. I'm excited. So you get a bunch of write primitives. In the classic approach, you would try to find probably an executable memory region. We tried as well, but the SMM has a static page table where all the pages with code are read-only, and all pages containing data are non-executable. In the classic approach, you would try to forge an arbitrary payload. And here, even though we have a few write primitives, their number and variety does not really let us craft anything decent. And lastly, you would strive to get unrestricted memory access. And here, once again, the SMM's page table hinders our exploitation. So it appears that most of the non-SMRAM RAM is simply not mapped into the SMM's page table. What's even more annoying is the page table resides in read-only pages, meaning that new pages cannot be allocated, and all the properties and attributes are permanent. So even if we could somehow execute code in SMM, it would be very hard to do something interesting to, for instance, the OS. Not impossible, but hard. So as you're probably all convinced, a classic approach might not be very applicable here. So let's think a little bit out of the box and try to leverage some unique and internal mechanisms to the SMM. Which brings us to the actual code execution. But first, as usual, some background. So here's the SMRAM. Each core has a designated region in the SMRAM. It is pointed to by the SM base MSR. Each core has an MSR of its own. If we zoom into one of these regions, we'll see a bunch of interesting things, but we'll focus on two. The safe state, the state of the CPU prior to entering SMM, and the SMI handler entry point, which is the first code that would be executed once you enter SMM. Yes, it's written there, so it's true. So we saw that the safe state has the general purpose registers, but it contains so much more. For instance, it contains the value of the SM base MSR. What is even more interesting, that the proper way to modify this MSR is by writing to its value stored in the safe state. And this operation is pretty special. How special is it? It's so special that it has a name. It's called SM-based relocation. From the developer's point of view, it's pretty straightforward. They simply modify the SM-based value in the safe state, and some magic behind the scenes does the SM-based relocation and points it to the new location. Which brings us to the actual attack idea. So let's create some memory region that is accessible from both kernel and the SMM. And there we will create our own fully controlled SMI handler entry point, which is the first code that would be executed upon entering SMM. Then we plan to use our write primitive to modify the SM-based value in the safe state to point to our newly created region. This way, we will trigger an SM-based relocation, and it will pave the path towards code execution in SMM. Oh, what a thrill! But it doesn't work. At least not out of the box. And it doesn't work because of, or I'd rather say, thanks to, the SMM feature control MSR. Sorry. And in particular, this nasty little bit, the SMM code check enable bit. So whenever this bit is set, and you're running code in SMM, and you try to execute code outside of the SMRAM, you simply get an exception. And if that's not enough, there is a log bit, which means that this MSR cannot be modified or changed in any way until the next reboot. And well, rebooting the machine or cutting down the power to the CPU kind of defeats our purpose. So Jonathan and I sat and thought, what could be the closest thing to rebooting the machine? And then it hit us. We'll put the machine to sleep, and in particular to S3, which is a nifty state where the processor is idle, but the system memory keeps on working. And as the processor gets no power, all the interesting things there, for instance, the MSRs, are simply zeroed out. And if you care about your MSRs, and you do, you can simply, just before you put your machine to sleep, copy those MSRs to the memory, and once you're back from sleep, copy them back. So let's have a look at the state of our beloved SMM code check enable bit. In normal execution, it is set. When we go into S3, it is still set. When we come back from S3, when the CPU got no power, its value is cleared. And at a very, very early stage, at returning from sleep, there is some initialization code that turns it back on. So let's zoom in and have a look at this code. So here's the function that is part of the S3 resume path, the path that is executed when your computer wakes up. So here we have the actual write to the MSR with a certain value that comes from the RAM. And what's interesting here is that it's inside an if statement. And if the condition does not hold, this MSR is simply 0. And in particular, if the MSMM feature control supported global variable is 0, then this mitigation will not be set. Remember that we have a write primitive to the SMRAM, to where this variable is located, which brings us to the full recipe of code execution in SMM from ring 0. So first, we set the value of the MSMM feature control supported to 0 using one of our lovely write primitives. Then we put the machine to sleep, wake it up. At this point, the function you previously saw is executed. The if statement, the condition in the if statement does not hold, meaning this mitigation simply is not turned on. Then we create our own region in a in a region of memory that is accessible from both ring 0 and SMM, and then we create our own fully controlled SMI handler entry point, which, if you recall, is the first code executed upon entering SMM. Then we use our write primitives once more to do an SM-based relocation so that it would relocate to the previously created memory. We trigger an SMI, and drumroll, please, we have code execution in SMM. All right. So, frankly speaking, this method is awesome. But it gets even better. So the SMI handler entry point actually starts running in real mode, which means there is no page table restrictions whatsoever because, well, there is no page table. And what's even more funny is that the entity that is responsible to setting up the CR3 register, which points to the page table, is our SMI handler entry point, which we fully control. And as we crafted our own SMI handler entry point, we have unrestricted access to anything, even read-only pages in the SMRAM. So we don't mind read-only memory. We don't mind non-executable memory. As a matter of fact, we don't mind the SMM static paging, or the heap guard, or any of these mitigations on this list. Well, you know, there is an ancient proverb that states that a picture is worth 1,000 words, while a live demo is worth 1,000 hacks. So it's demo time.
All right. So it's time for a live demo time. And using Benny, my humble hacker, will try to run code inside SMM. So let's begin by rebooting this machine. OK.
Oh, no, you see my password. Shoot. I did a screenshot. Shoot. It's a live demo.
OK. We'll reboot the machine. And please notice the nice Intel logo that you will see soon. This Intel logo is stored on the SPI flash. And the SPI flash is accessible only to SMM, and actually it is writable only by SMM. So if we are able to run code inside SMM, it means we are able to modify this logo. So we messed up with this machine a little bit, and it takes it some time to boot. So to make your time more convenient, let's have a small music. So in the recent spirit of AI changes, we asked ChatGPT a couple of questions. We asked ChatGPT, what is SMM? And he told us that SMM is kind like of a old grumpy grandpa who doesn't like to be bothered unless it's absolutely necessary. It spends most of its time napping on a comfy chair, but as soon as there is trouble, it springs into action like a superhero. It's like your grandpa suddenly transferred into an Iron Man whenever there was a crisis. So our next question was, and when this grandpa jumps into action? And he told us, SMM doesn't come to play very often. It's kind of like a rare Pokemon that you can only activate with the right combination of buttons and codes. So when SMM does make an appearance, you know you're in for something big. And we're in for something big. So let's stop with the stupid music and hop into action. All right. Oh, it doesn't boot it yet. So we will begin our attack by crafting a small write primitive. Because we are very limited with the different write primitives we have, and we want a 0 write primitive, we will start by trying to create a 0 write primitive. And remember, this is a race condition, so it's statistical, and it takes some time for it to be exploited. And we'll begin with it. So please notice the nice RingHopper here. And we were able to create a first route primitive. Now we'll try to disable our global. Cheer it up, we need it. Okay, so now we hoped it worked, and we will read the MSR. So you probably don't see it because it's very low here, but the value of the MSR is 5, which is 2 bits that are enabled. Bits, the first bit and the third bit, which is both the enable bit and the lock bit, will go into a suspend, meaning to S3. Go ahead. And if you weren't suspicious of your machine going to sleep until now, randomly going to sleep, I hope that now you will be. We will hop back from sleep state, check the state of the MSR, and it is 0. All right, let's continue. So now, I will tell you, everyone, please look to this camera, raise your credit cards in the air, and say SMM.
SMM!
All right. So we'll do now the SM-based relocation attack. And hopefully it will work. And then we will be only left to trigger our payload. And it worked. Let's trigger our payload. Perfect. Please notice that the machine freezes because all the cores are going idle, right? And we are only left to reboot the machine. And drum rolls. Voila! Okay. So, at this point, you probably know that we didn't thought that it will work, but lucky for us. So, to understand the full implications of the issues we have found, we need to understand the UEFI ecosystem. So, everything begins with the Tiano core project, or what some of you may be familiar with, the indicators, or practically the source code for any of your UEFI BIOS firmwares. Then comes the IBVs, the independent BIOS vendors. One of them is AMI, the vendor for the Intel NUCs. They take this source code, add the huge portion of functionalities, basically all the SMI handlers, and deliver it to the OEMs, to the original equipment manufacturers. Intel is one of them in case of the Intel NUCs. Then it gets back to you guys, the end customers. So in the attempt to estimate how many devices are vulnerable, we tested a couple of OEMs and IBVs firmwares, and we found that only in 2020, there were manufactured more than 200 million devices that are vulnerable. This makes us easily believe that there are more than 1 billion devices that were vulnerable to RingHopper, which is absolutely crazy. And if things weren't bad enough, let's make things even worse. So up until now, we hopped from Ring 0, the kernel, to SMM, aka God mode. But the title of our talk is hopping from user space to God mode. So let's extend our attack. And to do so, we need to do 3 things from user space. We need to be able to generate DMA transactions from user space, to trigger SMIs from user space, and to write a specific physical memory. So let's begin with generating DMA transactions. So remember the previous diagram? Now, hooking from the kernel is no longer a JIT, right? We are running in user space. So at this point, Benny and I got a little bit frustrated, and what can we do to make it work from user space? And we realized that it's much more simpler than we thought. Both in Linux and Windows, you have the read file API, the simple API, and with the appropriate flag, which tells the kernel, simply do not buffer the request and get the data back to us directly. We were able to generate DMA transactions from user space. So let's discuss how to trigger SMIs. We stumbled across Alex Matrosov's tweet, which is one of the famous UEFI research gurus, which has probably for any of your low-level desired functionality, you can find a BIOS vendor tool that does everything for you. And indeed, we find such. So AMI provides two drivers, a Linux driver and a signed Windows driver. And both of them provide us with the API for triggering any arbitrary SMIs that we want. All right, we are left to discuss how to write a specific physical memory. So remember, communication to SMM is done via special buffers. It is located outside the SMRAM. And we also described this as the input buffer previously. And the way to transfer it to the SMM as a parameter is using the save state. And to be more precise, using one of the general purpose registers. So in order to access this buffer, which currently holds only the physical address of it, we need the corresponding virtual address to access it from user space. Luckily for us, again, the drivers create this virtual to physical mapping for us. So let's chain it all up. We will map this non-SMRAM buffer into our unaccessible user space address, and we'll perform simultaneously the following loop. On one core, we will trigger SMI with the provided buffer as an input, and on a second core, we will read this malicious file into this input buffer. Using it, we will be able to exploit this time of check, time of use write primitives only from user space, which was great. OK, so now we can fully hop from user space to ring -2. OK, so 2 less slides and we're up. So let's discuss the timeline. So the issues were reported initially on June 21st. And then after some hard work with the different IBVs and OEMs, and even the US CERT, which helped us to coordinate the issues to all the vendors and OEMs, the issues were fully fixed on November 22. And the embargo was also expired at this moment. And this brings us to today, to BlueHat IL. So a couple of takeaways for the end. UEFI threats are real. With the recent Black Lotus and hopefully our work, we hope that we encouraged you to update your BIOS after this talk. If you want to become a UEFI researcher, then SMI handlers compose the most fruitful attack surface, and this is where you want to begin. And finally, UEFI research has an interesting future, both in terms of new mitigations and new attacks. So stay tuned. Thank you, everyone.